Yeah. I didn't get it. But you know, you guys, so we're sneaking around. We're not, we're there till I'm walking. This color also. It's very similar to my original.
Everybody come on in, grab a seat. We're gonna get started. There's a couple of seats up here. I see some seats over there. Okay, welcome to the JCC. I want to welcome all of you who are joining us here for tonight's program, whether you're here in person or attending via live stream. In either case, we think you're going to find this program very informative and interesting, and we truly appreciate you all joining us for this, hopefully first of many important conversations. I also want to thank our sponsors for tonight's programs. Thanks go out to our host sponsor, the JCC, the Phyllis B. Frank Pride Center of Rockland County, Congregation Sons of Israel of Nyack, the Jewish Federation and Foundation, the Holocaust Museum and Center for Tolerance and Education, the Justice Brandeis Law Society, and Lisa Zeiderman of the law firm of Miller Zeiderman. Thank you to one and all for your dedication to equality for all with no exceptions. 1929, paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code criminalized homosexuality. 6 years later, the Nuremberg race laws formed the cornerstone of Nazi racial policy. The introduction in September of 1935 heralded a new wave of the Nuremberg race laws, heralded a new wave of anti-Semitic legislation that brought about immediate and concrete segregation. German judges could not cite commentary or opinions by Jewish authors. Jewish officers were expelled by the army, and Jewish university students were not allowed to sit for their doctoral exams. In 1937 to 38, Jews were required by law to register their property, and they were prevented from earning a living. Jewish doctors could not treat non-Jews, and Jewish lawyers had their license to practice law revoked. In 1938, Jewish men and women with non-Jewish first names had to add either Sarah or Israel to their first names, and all Jews had to carry identification cards and have their passports stamped with the letter J. Jews were barred from public schools and universities, cinemas, theaters, sports facilities, and designated Aryan zones. All told, between 1929 and 1939, there were over 400 legal restrictions placed on Jews and other groups and the people who live, love, and work with or for them. For context, in Europe during those years, Jews made up less than 2% of the total European population. And this 2%, 10 million or so people, made up 60% of the worldwide Jewish population, which at that time totaled approximately 15.3 million people. Estimates of the LGBTQ population in the United States range anywhere from 3.5% to 10% of the population, or between 9 and 24 million people, with similar percentages calculated worldwide. This out of a total population, US population of 340 million. Now, I'm a Jewish gay judge, so we know why I'm here. But I'm equally interested in understanding the genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Darfur, Bosnia, and understanding the systemic discrimination that impedes the move towards full equality for our Black brothers and sisters, Indigenous people, and other people of color, even though those laws do not ostensibly directly impact me. But of course, in the end, we all know they do. Laws that target any one group can be, and usually are, then used to target others. And society suffers in ways large and small, both psychically, reputationally, and economically when hate is codified in our laws. It is the creation of the, quote, other, the ramping up of rhetoric to divide the other from the rest, to make the other the scapegoat to distract from the naked grab for money, power, and control. Instilling fear of the other based on false or highly exaggerated stereotypes. Then laws are passed, less harsh laws at first, with progressively more harsh and restrictive laws to follow. First aimed at one group, and then slowly being applied to all the others. Slowly but surely indoctrinating folks on the badness of the other. Judges are appointed who will do the bidding of those in power, while non-collaborators are removed, targeted, and punished. But what about the good people, the ones who oppose those laws? Well, let's ban books that may educate them about the truth. Let's prevent those people from voting. Let's publish propaganda as fact to get everyone rallying against the other. Remember, the Nazis killed 6 million Jews, but they also targeted and murdered Romas, what they called asocials, Black people, disabled people, Freemasons, gay people, Jehovah's Witnesses, Poles and Slavic POWs, political opponents, and trade unionists. In the last several years, over 540 anti-LGBTQ bills have been introduced in state legislatures throughout the country. 45 such laws were passed in the US in 2023 alone. Over 220 of those laws specifically target transgender and non-binary folks. Some preventing doctors from treating their patients and requiring teachers and neighbors to become snitches, and empowering the state to take trans kids away from their parents. Starting to sound familiar? The questions for today's panel are numerous, and we have asked them to speak to many. A few overarching questions I'd like to hear about are the current anti-LGBT laws and book banning laws similar to the Nuremberg laws? In what ways are they similar, and in what ways are they different? Why should non-LGBTQ people care? How do we engage those who say, it's not that bad, or the laws don't impact me? Our panelists include Rabbi, Professor, Dr. Michael Bernebaum, Professor of Jewish Studies at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles, among several other roles he holds or has held around the world. Professor Arthur Leonard, who is a professor emeritus of labor and employment law at New York Law School and an expert in LGBTQ legal issues. And our very own Loren Klein, Director of Health and Wellness at the Phyllis B. Frank Rockland Pride Center right here in the county. To lead our panel in this discussion is Rabbi Ayelet Cohen, who is the pro-resident dean of the Rabbinical School of the Jewish Theological Seminary. That's a long title. And is, among other things, the former spiritual leader at Congregation Beit Simchat Torah in Manhattan, which is the largest LGBTQ synagogue in the world. Each of our panelists' bios are included with the program materials, and I urge you to review the impressive backgrounds, educational achievements, publications, and experiences of each. I am quite sure you will be as impressed as I was. Now, I've been asked to introduce, before we proceed with Rabbi Cohen, I've been asked to introduce Ari Rosenblum, who is from the Jewish Federation and Foundation, who'd like to say a word.
Tonight, just very quickly, I wanted to also recognize and thank our panelists, our partners and co-sponsors, our allies, and the lay leadership from our organization who are here and from other organizations as well. Your leadership gives us direction and gives us the opportunity to present great programs like this. I wanted to say one more thing, and that is that it is really a function of everything I do to draw lessons from Jewish history, as this program does. And in doing so, I recognize that for a period of probably about 2,000 years, Jewish people did not have any allies. Jewish people really didn't have a single one until the 20th century, really until, in substance, until after the Holocaust. And so it is not only gratifying, it is essential that we maintain and build the alliances and the friendships and the collective power that we can develop in this and in every other endeavor that seeks to provide a responsible way of confronting the kind of laws that we're talking about here, confronting hate, confronting intolerance. And so with special thanks for the alliance that we do have with the Rockland Pride Center, Brooke. It's been in my 2 years here, really one of the greatest joys that I have to know that we can look outside of our community and find allies there. So thank you all again for coming, and thank you all, those of you who've really taken up this cause. Thank you for your leadership.
I'm going to turn the program over to Rabbi Cohen.
Thank you so much. I just want to add my thanks to all of the wonderful co-sponsors of the event tonight who have done a tremendous job of making this happen and putting together this really fantastic panel, and especially to Rabbi Ariel Russo and to Tamara Furman, who did an incredible and tireless job. It's been absolutely a pleasure to be a part of the build-up with some of you in this room and to be here today. So thank you. So we find ourselves in the Jewish calendar in a month of Elul. Rosh Hashanah is alarmingly soon for those of us who know what to do to prepare. And it is, of course, a time of an accounting. We take an accounting of our souls, we take an accounting of our lives. And we think about where we are in relationship with ourselves, with our loved ones, our community, and the larger world. And it seems to me that this is exactly the kind of conversation we should be having in this season. To think about where we stand, where each of us feels safe and feels vulnerable, where we may feel that we could be doing more to stand up for others and to speak our truth. And it is absolutely a time to rethink our commitments and to strengthen them. And so with that, we'll turn to our conversation. Michael, we'll start with you. We heard from Sherry's fantastic introduction, some historical overview, but perhaps you can start us with a little bit more detail about what the Nuremberg laws were and how they were enacted.
First of all, thank you. I want you to know that my daughter and Rabbi Cohen went to school together, went to university together. So it's a great privilege to see you as an adult. I think one of the last times I saw you was at your graduation, which was a short time ago. Let me do two things as briefly as I possibly can. Let me also preface it by saying I'm talking very often in 1930s language. And therefore I'm going to use terms that are not commonplace today. But I think unless I use those terms, I'm not giving you an apt description. Let me also say that when I speak in Germany very often, I speak in 1930s and 1940s German because I'm dealing with the documents of that period of time, and I must converse. So I begin with that because I'm going to use the term homosexual quite often, and I want you to understand that that's a historical term. Let me begin with the largest overview. The Nazis had multiple victims. Some were victimized for what they did. Trade unionists, political dissidents, social democrats. Some were victimized for what they refused to do. Jehovah's Witnesses were what I would call the voluntary victims because they refused to do multiple things. They would not register for draft. They wouldn't utter the word Heil Hitler. And they became social irritants when you walked in and everybody said Heil Hitler and they said good morning. Or you walked out and everybody said Heil Hitler and they said Auf Wiedersehen. And they continued to proselytize. they could sign a document and get out of concentration camps, but they were such pacifists that they could also serve as barbers to the SS. And I want you to understand the contradiction. Others were victimized for what they were. And in that sense, you have a double victimization. German later after 38, Austrian and after late 38 and 39, Czech, less Czechoslovakian because Czechoslovakia was broken up. Male homosexuals were victimized, and there was and the reason that women were not victimized, that lesbians were not victimized, can be done in a single phrase, which is lesbian wounds can breed the master race. And as long as women were barefoot and pregnant, they were all right. And they could even be coerced into having children, but they were not persecuted qua lesbians. I want to disagree with the judge on one thing, which is that the paragraph 175 was introduced in 1871. And it remained part of the Code of Germany until 1994. And it was not enforced after 1969. Now that becomes very important in terms of our record, because it meant people who were incarcerated as homosexuals were afraid to give testimony, write memoirs, and come forth, because they could still be persecuted for a very long period of time. So you had the combination of the arrest of German male homosexuals, their incarceration in concentration camps, and that change occurred in 1935. It occurred in 1935 because concentration camps became a place of protective custody, which is different than bringing you to trial and arresting you, bringing you to trial, confirming charges, going before a judge, etc., etc. And there were somewhere between 5,000 and 15,000 people who were essentially both incarcerated and who were paid, with 5,000 in all likelihood is a reasonable number of those who paid with their lives, because they were arrested in protective custody as homosexuals. Gay presumes a certain acceptance, and there was a dramatic reversal after 1934 of gay culture, and there also was a change in the law. And this becomes very important, a change in the language of the law. And that is that originally the paragraph 175 indicated unnatural acts. And unnatural acts essentially was interpreted by the courts as referring to intercourse and give direction and penetration. And after that was removed in 1935, it meant even male touching male, even looks at males could be a modality for protective custody. Nazi policy had a conflict, and the conflict with regard to this was a very simple conflict. It was a conflict between whether it was punishment or re-education. And people arrested this way, if they could become erect, looking at pictures of naked women, etc., what they were thinking in their mind was their business, but if they could become physically erect, they had the possibility of leaving camp. Last point on this, they were symbolized with the pink triangle. And one of the very interesting things about the transition and symbolization is one of the stages of genocide, but it's also a very important stage of the way in which we respond to the way in which others define us. So as you know, the yellow star was introduced in Warsaw as the white armband. But having said that, the first statement of the yellow star in response to it was, wear it with pride, that yellow star. And the fact that the pink triangle has been chosen as a symbol of the gay community is a very important transformation of the negative into the positive. In the same way in which if you see a necklace and somebody is wearing a Jewish star, that is a modality of identity, wearing it, as it were, with pride. Now, with that introduction, just to get it out as a painting the posterior history, let me say what the Nuremberg laws did and why they were important. The Nuremberg laws defined the Jews biologically, based on the religion of their grandparents. With all due apologies to Rabbi Goldberg, racism in Germany was not black-white. There were barely any blacks, with the exception of what they called, not me calling, the Rhineland bastards, who were children of French North African soldiers who had relations and marriage with German women. With the exception of those, there were very few blacks in Europe, and you have enormous evidence of, for example, survivors when they met black liberators, saying it's the first time they ever saw a black man, and they also saw the black men as angels. So if you go to survivors, they have a very different indication of black than somebody who grew up in America over a long period of time. Nuremberg laws defining the Jews biologically meant it was racially oppressed. They differentiated between full Jews, 4, 3, and 2 grandparents. 2 grandparents depended on the nature of affiliation and the nature of if there was membership in a Jewish organization, in a Jewish entity, if you were a member of the community. And then they had what they called Mishling, which is one, and I'm going to translate this, and again, I'm using precise, nasty, but I don't want to clean it up for you. Mishling, the best way to interpret the word Mishling is either mixed breed or mongrels. And therefore, if you had 2 Jewish grandparents and you were not affiliated, and they were not affiliated, if you had 2 Jewish grandparents, you were a Mishling. Then if you had 1 Jewish grandparent, you were Mishling of a 2nd degree and faced a number of handicaps all the way through. Could not employ a woman under the age of 45 in your home, an Aryan woman under the age of 45 in your home. Some say that's because Hitler's grandmother was a employee in the home of wealthy Germans and had a child out of wedlock. And therefore, but 45 is not because there's not sex after 45, but sexual relations after 45. But that was the far end of child rearing. And the Nuremberg laws became everywhere precedent. And that meant that wherever the Germans entered, wherever they occupied, that became the precedent. It also was applied to who was what they call gypsy, what we call Roma and Sinti, and it was used as an instrumentality. That also did one more thing, and I'm going to stop. It meant essentially that it engaged the church and the city institutions in the process of finding out who was Jewish. It yielded family courts, because how do I prove that my grandparents were Gentile or Catholic or Protestant? I have to go to church records. I have to go to church records, and I have to get those records, and compile it, and I have to look and see what's there. I have to bring it to a court, and then the judges were instrumentality. And throughout, we have to say that law was an instrumentality of persecution. And we only, and one of the other things I did was I got assigned to edit the Encyclopedia Judaica, and we had to reverse the entire consideration of law. Because what the original essay on law and Nazism was the degree to which the Nazis violated law. And we rewrote that completely to show how law was used as the instrument of persecution, of discrimination, of confiscation, etc., etc. And the end result is that you could literally say the Nazis committed no crime, because everything they did was legal. And also at the major meeting of January 20th, 1942, in which genocide, murder by gas became the absolute full product of Nazi Germany, 8 of the 15 men around the table, not gender specific, were lawyers. The law became, and the Ministry of Justice was represented by the number 2 person. 8 of them had doctors, the best and the brightest. I finished, I'm sorry.
Loren, we've heard about paragraph 175, but if you could speak about what else was going on, especially what was happening to transgender people in Nazi Germany in the 30s, and how was that in parallel with and at a different pace of what was happening to Jewish people?
Absolutely. Yeah, so I'm actually going to tell a story that I think illustrates or kind of grounds our conversation a little bit. Why are we here to talk about LGBTQ plus people? And for people who this is your first time hearing that, that's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people. It's a big umbrella. And why are we talking so much about transgender people? That's the other question that I hope this story will start to answer. So we go back to Germany of the 20s and 30s, specifically Berlin of the 20s and 30s. And in this period, there is a really great flowering and explosion and freedom for LGBTQ plus people. And there is a man there named Magnus Hirschfeld. Now Hirschfeld is Jewish and gay, and he runs something called the Institute for the Science of Sexuality in Berlin. And basically he's a researcher. He's trying to understand more about the lives of LGBTQ plus people. And he's also an advocate. He's speaking out against the discrimination which is already encoded into the law, and which, as the Nazis rise to power and influence, becomes more and more intense. Because this pre-period, this Weimar period, like some of these laws against LGBTQ plus people, and specifically gay men, are like not quite being enforced. Like it's sort of kind of looking the other way. So throughout the 1920s, Hirschfeld, and the other thing about Hirschfeld's Institute is like it's a magnet. It's a magnet. It's like a place that draws LGBTQ plus people, and particularly transgender people, from across Europe to build community, to learn and get new information. And something else that's happening, before we kind of talk about what happens to Hirschfeld ultimately, something that's happening is a very modern understanding of transgender identity is born in the 20s and 30s in Berlin. Transgender people, people who sort of, when I say that, I mean people who exceed the boundaries of man and woman, people who make the journey from one to the other, people who refuse both of the categories. Transgender people have always existed throughout time, throughout culture. We are in the Torah, we're in the Bible. I get a little emotional. If you've heard me speak before, this is something that happens. But yeah, so we have always existed, but in this moment in Berlin, this understanding of transgender identity as a need for alignment between the spirit and the body comes into being. And so as I continue our story, I want you to remember that some of the violence I'm going to talk about is happening to people who are substantially similar to me, sitting here in front of you as a transgender man. We understand ourselves in similar ways, we have similar wants and desires for our lives. And so throughout the 1920s, Hirschfeld is attacked anytime he appears in public by Nazi groups throughout the country. This campaign of intimidation culminates in 1933 when a group of Nazi students, this is difficult history, and I can imagine a lot of you are feeling it also. They take all of the books out of his library and burn them in the streets. And so the most famous image that we have of Nazi book burnings is actually the burning of Hirschfeld's LGBTQ+ library in Berlin. Immediately after this happens, Hirschfeld, his patients, his collaborators, everyone flees or is imprisoned or killed. And Hirschfeld dies in exile 2 years later. So I hope you kind of turn this story over in your minds as we continue our conversation, because this is the backdrop. And this is pretty early in the timeline, that persecution. Oh, yeah.
Let me add only one statement. The date in which this happened was May 6, 1933. Now, the reason that becomes absolutely important is because on May 10th, 1933, 4 days later, you had the famous book burning, or the infamous book burning, in which they burned, they raided all of the libraries of universities and the like, and they burned the books in the square opposite the University opposite the Opera House. So, and that was literally the 100th day of Hitler being in office. You think of Roosevelt's 100 days and Hitler's 100 days. So Magnus Hirschfeld was first, and then 4 days later, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the timeline is very, very, very important. And again, starting small and then explosive. And let me tell one short story. One of the people whose books were burned, by the way, not only were Jewish books burned, but books by Hemingway and William Keller and the like. One of the people had been given an honorary doctorate in November of 1932. And by May 10th, 1933, all of his works, which had been donated when he got the honorary doctorate, were set in flames. And Heinrich Heine had said a century before that people that burn books will ultimately burn people.
No, that was perfect, thank you. Yeah, so we're going to talk a lot about how transgender people, we're this very small minority. We are less than 1% of the US population. And so the forces that are in play today think that we are small and powerless, and so we're a good first target. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. So as we transition in our conversation from the historical context to today, one of the questions I think is really important for us to think about and address is the combination between incremental introduction of discriminatory legislation and legal decisions and shocking moments of very obvious violence, discrimination, book burning. And it takes a combination of these kinds of events to really create the conditions for a truly insidious culture change that allows for these ideas to prevail. And all right, maybe as you begin talking about the contemporary situation, I wonder if you want to start by reflecting on that element of it. Does that work?
Yes. Greetings, and my thanks as well for the sponsorship. this together. What's been happening over the past few years is a reversal of a trend that dates back to the middle of the 20th century in the United States, at least, when the LGBT community began to coalesce after World War II. And we had the formation of groups who wanted to reject the existing legal and social regime under which gay, lesbian, transgender people were considered to be mentally ill and subject to criminal prosecution and condemned by religious authorities as sinners, and were afraid to be open about who they were. There was a vast gay underground. In fact, it's interesting. World War II was one of the things that generated this, because it brought people from all over the country to the draft and to the military. And although the official policy of the US military during World War II was to want gay people to be in the military, they said homosexuality is inconsistent with military service because homosexuals are not real, or gay men are not real men. So they said they're unsuited for military service. And so if people were discovered to be gay in the military, they were given a bad conduct discharge. And they carried that on their records. And of course, if they were discharged in that way, they were not entitled to veterans benefits. After the war, there were gay veterans who got organized, people who were disqualified for benefits. And this is where some of the first gay rights organizations in the country, with some minor exceptions of things that people tried to start in the 30s, inspired by Hirschfeld, but they quickly were suppressed. But after the war, especially on the West Coast, there was a movement to petition Congress, to petition state legislatures, to demonstrate, to try to get off the books criminal statutes that made gay sex illegal everywhere in the United States. It wasn't until the Model Penal Code was proposed in the 1950s, and then a few states started to follow the recommendations of the American Law Institute to decriminalize consensual sex between adults of the same sex. And the first state to do that was Illinois, of all places. But there was a small wave of adopting the Model Penal Code, and since this was buried in a large proposed penal code of wholesale reform of American criminal law, it could sort of be snuck through, just a tiny part of it, until certain forces became alarmed and started to lobby heavily against those Model Penal Code provisions that liberalized the sex crimes laws. And the leading groups in this lobbying campaign were the Roman Catholic Church, Orthodox Judaism, and social conservatives in parts of the country saw this as somehow undermining their way of life to allow gay people to live openly without being harassed and without being imprisoned.
And of course, we know that partly because of those forces, even in New York State, sexual orientation non-discrimination legislation didn't pass until the 2000s.
You know,
And
it took a long time. But the point is that a movement that started in the 50s, and it was very slow going at first, but little by little, working at all the different ways in which the law discriminated or excluded people because of their sexuality, we managed to get reform. And some of it came through legislation, some of it came through lobbying, some of it came through the courts. And we have a tradition of judicial independence in the United States. We have a tradition of lifetime appointments to the federal courts, and supposedly that insulates them from politics. So we've got questions about that these days. But the courts actually played an important role from the 1970s and 80s on. We began to get court decisions saying that it violated fundamental fairness under the 14th Amendment and the Due Process Clause for the government to exclude gay people from various things. We started to get decisions that were turning things around, and then, and the big hero in this, the judicial hero in this, was Anthony Kennedy, who was appointed by Ronald Reagan to the Supreme Court, a conservative Republican, but a conservative Republican who one of his best friends was the gay dean of the law school that he taught at as an adjunct professor. And he took the lead role and very sharply split decisions, 5-4 decisions in many cases, in holding that it violated the equal protection guarantees of our 14th Amendment for a state to discriminate against gay people, in holding that it violated the 14th Amendment of the Constitution in making private, adult, consensual gay sex a crime, and holding that it violated the 14th Amendment of the Constitution in denying gay people the right to marry. Little by little, over a period of from the mid-1990s till in 2020, we got this incredible decision from the Supreme Court that discrimination against people because they're gay or transgender is sex discrimination, and therefore the civil rights laws, which date all the way back to 1964 on the federal level, which banned sex discrimination, apply to this kind of discrimination. And this came out in 2020. It's in the middle of the Trump administration, and you can bet that they fought against it and tried to narrow it. But I think the first sort of crack in going in the other direction was when Donald Trump unilaterally, in the summer of 2017, in a tweet, proclaimed that transgender people could not serve in the United States military. All of a sudden, this is the first, really, on an official level. And the whole sort of MAGA ideology has been dragged in to persecuting transgender people in this country.
So we're seeing that we were on a trajectory, both in terms of social norms, cultural representation, personal safety, and in terms of legislation, legal protection, legal rights. We were on a trajectory in a direction of progress, of protection, of rights. Suddenly we start to see that as powerful as those things seem to be and feel in certain ways and transform the lives of many people, a tweet from somebody in the White House can suddenly make it so clear how vulnerable LGBT people still are in this country.
Yeah, now I have to say the courts stood up. This was challenged in the courts, and at some point it seemed very clear that the courts were going to hold this unconstitutional federal courts. And once Joe Biden was elected, it was reversed.
So let's fast forward to today. What we are, what are we seeing right now? The laws that are currently under consideration or have already passed that specifically affect the rights and the lives of transgender Americans.
I believe it's an incredible array of things. Things as simple as birth certificates, for example. And this is an area where it took a lot of time, dating back to the 1970s, to try to get, you were identified as transgender and you were undertaken to transition, and you'd like to get your birth certificate changed to show the gender in which you live, so that it would be consistent with your life. And at first there was great resistance to this. There was resistance from the medical profession, among others. There was resistance by state legislatures, by city councils, but we made incredible progress until relatively recently. We had gotten to the point where in almost every state, you could get a birth certificate change to reflect your gender identity, how you're living your life. And now states, there are these legislative proposals to stop that, to say a birth certificate is a record of when you were born and how you were identified when you were born, and it would be falsifying that record to issue an amended birth certificate showing. And we're seeing this now, and we're seeing cases in the courts, and we're seeing legislative proposals. Driver's licenses. Would you like to have a driver's license that correctly identifies you? Because when does a driver's license salient in your life? When you stop at a police officer and they ask to see a driver's license and they look at the license, they say, well, just a minute. You're not this person. Well, getting your license changed is a crucial step. Getting your passport changed is a crucial step. Getting your social security records changed may be a crucial step. Getting your employer to recognize your gender is a crucial step. Which restrooms do you use in both public and private facilities? And we were making incredible progress on the restroom issue. We were winning these cases, and now we're seeing it's still being litigated. It's incredible. We won major Court of Appeals decisions 10, 15 years ago on this. And I do a newsletter on LGBT law, and I read just about all the cases that are coming out on LGBT issues. And this is still being litigated. There are still school districts that are saying that transgender students may not use the restroom consistent with their gender identity. And part of this reflects public opinion. I've seen this, but a recent study that showed that the majority of the public still is a bit leery of the idea that transgender people should be able to use the restroom consistent with their gender identity. But this is being litigated in many different parts of the country today. The driver's license issue is still being litigated in many places. The birth certificate issue is a biggie because now among these new laws are new laws saying that your gender as identified at birth remains permanent on your record and it can't be changed. And one of the next really startling things is what's going on with the ability of minors who are identifying as transgender to make that transition, the first part of which may be blocking puberty from kicking in, because once puberty kicks in and your body's changed, it's going to be much more difficult. If you're transitioning, there's going to be much more involved than if you can block puberty. And we had a governor and attorney general in the state of Texas, Mr. Paxton, who is now on trial in impeachment in the Texas Senate, and Governor Abbott, who decreed, basically, that it will be considered child abuse in the state of Texas for parents or doctors to assist minors in gender transition in any form, puberty blocking, and there are medications to block puberty from taking place, which are largely reversible if the decision is made by the individual if they don't want to go ahead with transition. You stop the puberty blockers and puberty kicks in. But cross-sex hormones, which is the next step in gender transition, is not totally reversible. And Governor Abbott and Attorney General Paxton said, we think it is child abuse for a minor to receive these medications.
So I want to take a moment just to say that if people have questions, you can pick up a card at the entrance, and maybe some people are going to come around with cards. If you want to jot a question down on the card, they're going to be brought up to me, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. You know, we're covering a lot of material here. So, you know, Texas and Florida have both been in the news a tremendous amount because of the legislation that they're passing, the specific restrictions, especially around education, school curricula, textbooks. And some of them feel frighteningly reminiscent of 1930s Germany. And I'd like to invite any of you to comment on those parallels.
Let me say that you made a very important point, which I want to reemphasize. It doesn't happen all at once. There is gradualism. Step is taken, and then another step is taken, and the third step is taken. Scholars of the Holocaust and of genocide in general have identified 10 stages of genocide that are present in every genocide, but don't necessarily come in order and don't necessarily follow one another. But and there's a very famous book called The Twisted Road to Auschwitz. Leonard, you know the book very well. The Twisted Road to Auschwitz means Auschwitz wasn't born whole. It was born with a gradualism. If you look at the elements of it, of genocide. You have symbolization. You then have persecution, discrimination, dehumanization, organization, because again, genocide must be organized, polarization, separation, and ultimately you get to what they call extermination. And if you speak Nazi speak, it's extermination. If you speak as a normal, decent human being, it's annihilation. And finally, denial. Now, every stage means that the opposition is much easier to stop at the beginning. Once it builds momentum, it becomes much more problematic and much more difficult. And once it gets organized, you're facing enormously entrenched elements. Had we been writing, ironically, the history of this period of time, and I can speak of this as one who's a graduate of the civil rights movement, has scars in my back from the civil rights movement, one would have said that the acceptance of gays in the United States was the most dramatic transformation with the least opposition that I've experienced in my lifetime. That if you think the comparison to the Brown versus Board of Education and then the Civil Rights Movement and all that took place, what we've had is the most dramatic acceptance at any point in time with literally the least resistance. And the danger now is that we're beginning to see a fragility of the sense of manhood, which is occurring in some of our political life. The sense of picking on the weakest link in the chain. And the last element, which is the most, I think, the most important, is the dramatic introduction of cruelty. In other words, meanness is now celebrated as a mark of authenticity. Last point about echoes. Education should be disruptive and ideas should make you uncomfortable. And history has to be written truthfully. And believe me, and I've worked in ancient history as well, history ain't pretty. Now, if you can't teach slavery, because again, makes some people uncomfortable, you can't teach the Holocaust. We should cry. In other words, you can't teach it. Now, let me touch on one more thing finally. I've written a great deal in recent times about the way in which admitting the past has made Germany a much better country. You had a chancellor voted, Angela Merkel, and Angela Merkel wanted to remember the Nazi past not because she loved Jews, wanted to enlarge the Jewish community and the like, but because she wanted a better Germany. She wanted a Germany that was democratic, that was acceptance, that was tolerant, that was pluralistic. She wanted a Germany that was receptive to immigrants, and she dealt in the Syrian crisis dramatically with that. Not because of anything external, she wanted the type of nation that would celebrate these values. So if you ban the teaching of slavery, you're essentially saying we don't want to confront racism. If you begin to say, don't say gay, you're saying we don't want to accept the fact that people can love who the hell they want. And it's none of our business. The type of America we want to shape is an America that is what? Pluralistic, tolerant, decent, and ultimately, and seriously, should be kind. We regard anti-Semitism as on the rise, and it's on the rise. But you can't separate it from the fact that hatred and the expression of hatred is dramatically on the rise. And the polarization that's involved in that, the vocabulary that's involved in that, is beginning of othering for a whole range of people. And otherhood is deeply problematic. Within society, polarization is one of the diseases in society, us and them, inside and outsider, people who are worthy, people who are not worthy, dramatically problematic.
I'm gonna say it plainly. They're trying to use trans people as a wedge. They think you're gonna be confused by us. They think you're gonna be scared of us. They are empowering you to have opinions about our personal business. My choices for my medical care, my choices of how I wanna live my life. It's not something that all of the people in this room or all people in America get to legislate. It's my decision. And for young people, it's a decision that they make with their parents and their doctors and their therapists and like a whole village of people that come together to say, what do you need, young person, to grow into a happy, healthy adult? And so that is what they are expecting. They're saying all of these right-minded people are going to be confused and scared. And so they're going to go along with this expansion. Okay, I guess they can say what a person can do with their body. And then how many more bodies does that expand to? They can say how you're going to raise your children. And then how many more groups of children does that expand to?
Well, you're both touching on why this is happening now, at a time when violence is on the rise, when hatred is on the rise, when incivility is on the rise, when people are emboldened in their hatred and white supremacy and racism and homophobia. And we see this play out in all kinds of ways, in the idea that it's possible to delegitimize someone's basic identity and decide for them that they don't exist. I also think it's important to name how much it's an effective political strategy in certain camps. And it's not a coincidence that just as Roe was overturned, this legislation intensified, because what's next? And there is a huge emphasis on fear-mongering and on amplifying what are really a tiny minority of cases in a tiny minority of the American population, and get people freaking out about who's going to go into their bathroom and what's going to happen, to scare them and to elevate difference and to elevate misunderstanding and willful misunderstanding. Can you talk about what we're already seeing in the states that are implementing some of these laws and policies? How is it impacting the lives of LGBT people in these states? Either of you. Sure.
So I can't necessarily speak to what's happening on the ground in Florida and Texas and Missouri and other states, but I can actually talk about what's happening here in Rockland County and in the Hudson Valley. So the Pride Center works with a lot of LGBTQ plus young people, their families, and we have seen since these laws are passing a rise in anxiety and depression. And there's national research which backs up what we're seeing here. There's a direct relationship between seeing these things on the news and feeling more anxious and depressed. Young people are being repeatedly hospitalized for mental health emergencies. They don't want to go to school. They don't want to participate in extracurricular activities. They get in conflicts with their parents because they're scared. They are scared that they will be taken away from their supportive families, which is something Texas and Florida have both floated as an idea. You know, it's child abuse to support your LGBTQ plus child. We'll take them and put them in foster care. So they're scared of that. They are angry about book banning, which is already happening here in Hudson Valley. There's, you know, what that represents for their school, how that's going to embolden the bullies. They're scared that their GSA clubs, their gay, gender and sexuality alliance, sort of like Pride or like safe space clubs, they're scared those will be shut down. And so that's kind of what we're seeing among our young people. But we're seeing it also with educators. There are a number of districts here in the Hudson Valley where like a group of agitators, anti-LGBT agitators will target a school or a district, and then they will do things like accuse the superintendent of being a pedophile with no evidence. They will harass and threaten school administrators, principals, until the point where like they have to be escorted by police to their car. These are like things, I can name the districts, I'm not going to, but these are things that are happening locally. And now these districts, like the administrators are leaving because they don't want to deal with that. They want to just support their kids and like teach them algebra. And so they're leaving and they're not able to fill these positions. And so it's destabilizing our public schools in general, which is like bad for everybody. We're also seeing it in the healthcare field. Some of these states are saying it's a felony, like charging doctors with felonies and 10 years in prison if they provide healthcare to transgender people. And so doctors here in the Hudson Valley, like I've talked to people and they've been like, if these laws come to New York, like I'm prepared to leave the region, I'm prepared to leave the country so I can keep, practicing medicine ethically. I'll just do it somewhere else. And like, we have bad doctor shortage. I don't really think we need to like lose any of them to this mess. So that's what we're seeing locally.
And this is another parallel of these fear tactics that are being used against physicians who provide abortion care, who provide gender affirming care, to try to scare them out of practicing medicine in a way that serves the needs and the survival of their patients.
Look, it's getting to absurd levels as well. You now have the question of transit people, we're seeing it on a national scale with Senator Tuberville, and the question of transporting and the military paying for the transport of people from areas in which healthcare can be fully provided to areas where healthcare cannot be fully provided, into areas where healthcare can be fully provided. You're now seeing certain towns enacting that you cannot transport somebody on their roads if they're about to get an abortion, and you're going to stop that type of thing. There's an anger and a fury and an attempt to use the law as an instrumentality of discrimination and of persecution. And this is a deeply problematic and divisive element. And I can tell you one of its impacts in terms of people not willing to move down to these places and people not willing to stay in these places. I just dealt with a colleague who was offered a very wonderful, high-paying job in Florida. He says, but I have a binary child. I can't move to Florida. And he said that. And nobody can argue that you can't do that. He lives in New York. He thinks the atmosphere is enormously tolerant. In Idaho, you have closed down a whole range of hospitals which offer gynecological services at birth, and doctors leaving in a tremendous amount. Some of them moving to right across the border to Oregon. You have a whole range of things that are taking place in the society, and there are forces in the society that are enormously destructive. And let's remember, all it takes for evil, one of the things it takes for evil to triumph is for people of goodwill to remain silent. And we have to be defined, as it were, by resistance, and by resistance in an articulate and the like, and also resistance in the sense of kindness. I keep saying if these, I keep saying when I speak in churches and I'm asked about the politics of this, I keep saying we had always been taught that Christianity is a religion of love. Well, why the hell are these guys hating so much? And why is the Roman Catholic Church in America against the Pope? Against the Pope, who is saying, you know, we have to be open and loving and pastoral in a very deep and profound way. And there, we have an entire ethos at this moment. And let's also face it, we have new tools. You have the tool of the internet, which means that everybody has access to what used to be much more difficult to organize. You have social networks, which means we live with mutual support and bubbles. And this is a tremendously impactful element, and who the hell knows what artificial intelligence is going to add to this.
Can you say a little bit more about what's happening nationally in other states in terms of these kinds of efforts and the ways in which they're kind of contagious from one state to another, and also the ways in which kind of the opposition can learn from each other in terms of trying to block these measures?
Yeah, there is a sort of copycat element to this, and you can see it in the way what Florida has done in terms of restricting curriculum has spread to other states. You can see it in terms of the statutes on gender affirming care. They don't only address gender affirming care, that is assisting youth who identify as transgender in making a smooth transition, as opposed to being forced not to transition until they become adults. Included in many of those laws are pronoun provisions, which say that the schools are not required to use pronouns that are desired by the transgender students. They can misgender them in letters. Of course, they don't consider it misgendering because they don't agree that gender identity is a real thing. It's interesting, there's a decision by a federal district court in Florida, who struck down one of these things, and he said, gender identity is real. And you wouldn't think that's a revolutionary statement, but you know, you look at the debates in the state legislatures, and they say, oh, it's all in their minds. It's not real. And it's contagious. They're imitating each other. And this judge heard lots of expert testimony and decided it's real. And a few other judges now have echoed that. But the problem we're having is these trial judges are mainly coming to the right conclusion, and then it gets up to the Court of Appeals. And we now have 2 federal circuit courts of appeals that are on the other side and are allowing these laws to go into effect after they were temporarily blocked by the trial courts. But so there's the pronoun thing. And then there's the snitch thing. And this is the part where I see parallels to things that were happening in the 30s, where in the schools, the students were told to report on their parents, saying it was subversive or that it was opposed to Hitler's regime. Well, now we have something that is sort of analogous when a student comes to a counselor and says, I'm concerned my gender identity, I'm struggling with this, you provide me with counseling, you provide me with referrals. And oh, by the way, my parents, I think they would be very much opposed to all this, so please don't tell them anything. And in some school districts, the school districts have adopted policies that say you must tell the parents if the student comes to them. But there are other districts that say you mustn't. You must respect the confidentiality. And now groups of parents are going into court and asking the court to declare that the confidentiality policies violate the parents' rights as parents. They say we have a right to know. So this battle is being played out around the country now. There are lawsuits in various places with groups of parents suing the schools saying we have a right to be told. And then there are cases where statutes say that the counselor must tell, and that's being attacked.
So there's a question from the floor, which talks about how frequently parallels are being made now to Nazi Germany. That every time someone sees something they don't like, they accuse the person compared to the Nazis. Is this a situation where it's kind of cheapening or diminishing that capacity? How do we deal with that, and how do we learn from it?
The Holocaust, I have been writing for 30 years about this. The Holocaust has become what we can call the negative absolute in the world. We don't know, we live in a world of relatives, we don't know what's good, we don't know what's bad. What we do know is the Holocaust was evil. And one of the reasons deniers deny it is because they want to deny it, precisely that evil. By the way, that essentially means that when you want to scream about something, the last word you use, or the third word you use, or the fifth word you use is Nazi, Holocaust, etc., etc. Now you have stupidity. Our good friend Marjorie Taylor Greene could not distinguish between gazpacho and Gestapo. I have a friend, and she called Nancy Pelosi imposing the gazpacho. Now, before you laugh, have a little bit of sympathy, because that means she's never had gazpacho. And I don't know about you, but gazpacho is one of my favorite summer soups. You also have people who spoke about Mass as the equivalent of Jewish stars. Masks were used to protect one another in mutual responsibility. Jewish stars were used to stigmatize a group, etc., etc. So the reason, the comparison to the Holocaust is one of the great success stories of Holocaust education, and one of the great deepest dilemmas of it. Success is people understand the Holocaust was evil. Nazi, bad. By the way, not everybody. We have a repeat of it and all of that. And ultimately, if you begin to hate, you begin to mimic the Nazi universe. So that's the success story. The trivialization, the vulgarization, the false comparison makes it absolutely, it riles one's blood, and it is also a way in which if everything is the Holocaust, then nothing is the Holocaust. If everything is Nazi, then nothing is Nazi. Let me add one thing to you. I'm old enough to have counseled a period of time when abortion was illegal. And I counseled in a state that we never referred somebody to someone in state, we referred somebody to someone out of state in order to preserve us. My then wife was working in a public school system in a rural county with a cold, very cold climate. And there was a lot of drinking, and there was a not inconsiderable amount of incest. And when we had parental notification as a requirement, I can tell you from experience that parental notification was a prescription for murder. So anybody who argues this doesn't understand it. I can tell you this from experience. And when I was involved in counseling with this, the people who referred people to me were Protestant ministers and Roman Catholic priests who understood this in a very deep way. So the idea of parental notification endangers the child in a profoundly dramatic way and endangers the entire situation. Now that's very different than somebody who tells you, if somebody comes to me in counseling and tells me it's sexual abuse, I have a requirement to report. If somebody comes and tells me they're about to commit murder, even a psychiatrist has an obligation to report. But notification and violation of that confidentiality is a prescription for enormous violence and murder. I have seen it. I have seen it. And I've also seen mothers in an incestuous situation who were neighbors. And this is not, and I hate to say it, it wasn't quite uncommon. So I belong to a generation that experienced this back alley stuff. And therefore parental notification is they only have to know what they're saying when they're speaking about parental notification, because we all have an obligation to protect children.
I'm running short, unfortunately, although there's so much to say. So I'd like to turn to each of you for some closing thoughts on what we, as largely a Jewish room on the eve of the high holidays, as workers, as people who are engaged in this county, in the state, in national politics, what can we do? How can we get involved? How can we be useful as we see this unfold? So Art, we'll start with you and then Michael.
Well, I was struck a few weeks ago by a sermon given by my rabbi, Sharon Feinbaum, at Congregation JCC Rockland, on the anniversary of the March on Washington Civil Rights, the famous speech by Dr. King, the I Have a Dream speech. And she pointed out that the speaker directly before Dr. King was a rabbi from New York, originally from Berlin, named Joachim Prinz, who made a speech, rather short, but very, very pointed. He said, he started out, he said, I am here as an American Jew. And why should the Jews be concerned about Black civil rights? And he says, it's our history, it's our DNA, that we were strangers in Egypt, we were slaves once, we lived in ghettos in Europe, we were subjected to segregation. We know what this is all about. And we have to be concerned about the equal civil rights of everybody. And it's our obligation as Jews to speak up. He said, the greatest sin was silence. That there was this great civilization in Germany, and there were all these people who stood by and were silent as this was happening. So, I think one of the things we have the obligation to do is to speak against it, to speak against the current trend, and to support those organizations who are fighting to vindicate the rights of transgender people. And there are plenty of them. They're out there, they're doing great work in the courts, they're doing great work in legislatures trying to lobby to block bad legislation. And we hear that there are over 400, over 500 bills just in the past year in state legislatures. And how many passed? 40 something. But in a lot of places, they were blocked because people stood up and said this is wrong. Or they were weakened in various ways. They're not all as bad, although they're all pretty bad. But some are worse than others, and in some cases, compromises were made, and things weren't as draconian. For example, there's one state where you can't give minors cross-sex hormones, but you can use puberty blockers. So, little compromises are made. But the point is, be active, be observant. When you see stories about this in the press, pay attention to them, don't say that's not my issue. And provide support to the organizations that are fighting for the civil rights of everybody.
Civil society must prevail. Civil society must prevail. Civility has to be part of the discussion. We have to unpack a whole range of hypocrisy, and we have to quiet down the meanness and respond with a certain sense of grace and a certain sense of decency and dignity. And we also have to remember the ultimate fact, which is the violation of someone else's rights. Ultimately, is the violation of all of our rights. You all know the famous statement of Pastor Niemöller. First they came, and there's a whole range of questions about. First they came for the trade unionists, I didn't speak out, I wasn't a trade unionist. Came for the communists, I didn't speak out, I wasn't a communist. Came for the Jews, I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Jew. And finally, when they came for me, there was no one left to speak out. Let me give you a wonderful admonishment from a Hasidic story. Hasidic master said, sometimes you shout at the world to change the world. And sometimes you shout at the world even louder to make sure the world doesn't change you.
Thanks for letting me have the last word. I believe in everyone in this room. I believe that you can see through the propaganda that's going on. We've given you a little bit of some tools of how to sift through what is true and what is not true. I also, we have the power to stop this. We do. The power is sitting in this room. I know that there are people here who have they/thems for grandchildren, and you don't want to see them suffer. You know, we all have people we love, and this is not the America we want to live in. You know, and we all have the power to say, no, it stops here. Never again, it's right now. So think about what you have access to. Maybe your life is full of responsibilities and all you have to give is money. Great. Maybe you have a big network, and when you see something on the news, you can tell them, hey, you know what? Boston Children's Hospital just got bomb threats for treating LGBTQ plus young people. We should probably email them and say, good job, keep going. Final thing is I would ask each of you to consider what you are willing to do to resist an unjust law. Because I'm not a legal scholar, but we are one Supreme Court decision away from some of this stuff coming here to New York, in the blink of an eye. And so I ask you to consider what your action plan would be if that were to happen.
Thank you so much for sharing your truth, for sharing your wisdom. We are grateful for each of you for listening, for thinking about what is possible for you. A great teacher of mine, an activist named Gadi Barya, who talks about how each of us can think about our home, our area in which we will take responsibility. Maybe your thing is education. Maybe your thing is Rockland County. Maybe you're a second homeowner in Florida. Maybe what you're worried about is youth. Maybe what you're worried about is health. Maybe what you're worried about is honest reporting. You can't do everything, but you can do something. And so if we can carry into this new year a sense of responsibility for figuring out one thing that each of us can commit to doing that we didn't do before, but we know is within our reach and within our area of personal connection, then we can be a part of resistance.
Is this one working? Okay.
We can each be part of change and of resistance. And so I wish all of you a sweet and a healthy new year, full of possibility, full of change, full of justice, full of standing up for one another. Shana Tova.